Okay. Hi, everybody. We are live. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to this live Prezi webinar. We have a very special guest with us here today, Andy Springer from the Rain Group. Do you want to say hi, Andy?
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon.
Exactly. So we've still got a few people logging in, so we're going to give them a minute or two to get settled and then we'll get underway. Now, whilst that happens, I'll introduce myself a little bit. My name is Spencer Waldron. I'm the Global Brand Communication Director here at Prezi, and I'm based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And you can probably hear from the accent that I'm originally from the UK. And I'm also going to be presenting later about how to do a dazzling virtual presentation. Andy, where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining you from the beautiful Sydney, Australia. So our office is located about 35 minutes north for those of you who have been down to this neck of the woods. Yeah, super excited to be here and share some great insights with everyone.
I'm jealous. I could do with some of that weather.
It's actually looking like a pretty impressive day.
Okay, so I think we're good to go. So thank you everybody for joining us for today's webinar. It's called How to Capture Attention and Engage Buyers in Virtual Sales Meetings. Something that's probably top of mind for all of us. We've got Andy Springer here from the Rain Group, who has so much experience and knowledge to share with you today. Now, there's many things that I'm eager to tell you about Andy, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. But first, I wanted to just go through a couple of housekeeping things with everybody on the call. So yes, we are going to be recording the webinar, and yes, we're going to send it to you via email afterwards. So no need to take notes unless you really want to. The webinar is going to run for somewhere between 50 minutes and an hour. There's going to be two sessions. So Andy's going to go first, and then we'll do some Q&A after his session. And then I'm going to do a session after that, and then we'll have a Q&A session again at the end of there. So lots of chances to ask questions, which brings me to how you can ask questions. So you see in the Zoom window, there's two buttons. There's a Q&A button and a chat button. So if you have questions for Andy when he's doing his session, or for me, then please use the Q&A box. So to talk to the speakers or to ask a question to the speakers, use the Q&A box. And the chat box or the chat button is for everything else. If you want to communicate with each other or communicate with some of the Prezi folks behind the scenes as well. So maybe let's do a quick test of this. Why not go to the chat box and just tell us where you're calling in from? It'll be nice to see where people are. Oh, here we go. We have, wow, Atlanta and New York City, Germany, Atlanta, Phoenix, Boston, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Dallas, Taiwan. Wow, everybody from all over the world. Awesome. Great to have you here. Okay, so let's talk a bit about Andy before we kick off. For those of you who don't know who Andy is, he is one of the best experts in sales high performance and the co-author of the Amazon bestseller, Virtual Selling: How to Build Relationships, Differentiate, and Win Sales Remotely. As the Chief Client Officer of the Rain Group, Andy drives the design and delivery of client results for the firm that's been on the Selling, Power and Training industry's top 20 sales training companies list for many years. Now, Andy has also worked with hundreds of sales teams to drive long-lasting sales improvement for small, mid-market, enterprise and government clients. So it's pretty fair to say we're in good hands for today's session. So Andy's going to talk to us about how virtual selling can be more engaging. So at this point, I'm going to hand the floor over to Andy, who's going to start today's presentation. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Spencer. Hello to everyone again from wherever you are joining us around the world. We've got, I guess, a conversation to start with, a bit of content. Love to hear your thoughts, your questions as you go. As Spencer said, my role is primarily to help engage with our clients, understand their pain points, the areas of challenge and the objectives that they seek. In this case, transitioning a lot of their work, their sales force to virtual selling, and not just being able to show up and do it, but do it at a level that represents excellence and best practice. So I'm a practitioner. I spend a lot of my time in live, in situ with a lot of large organizations around the world, helping them make that transition with the team that I work with. And I thought for today's webinar, there's 4 really key points that we're going to share in terms of when you are afforded that opportunity to have a buyer or a group of buyers in a virtual setting, in a virtual meeting. What are some of the ways that we can capture their attention and engage buyers? I know there's a lot of you, and there's probably two predominant camps of sellers that we're going to be hearing from a little bit later in terms of your questions and where you're from. Typically, what we find is for some of you, you are brilliant at face-to-face selling. Whether you're in B2B, a lot of you would be in the B2B space. You've made your career off that. You hold an audience incredibly well. You're able to collaborate on the fly. You're able to read a room. You're able to build rapport almost intuitively. You walk in and it's just what you do. And then a pandemic hits and suddenly what you've done that's created the success for you over a period of time suddenly changes. The ballpark changes. 1 minute you're playing basketball or you're a superstar. The next minute you're told to turn up and be a Major League Baseball player. Totally different skill sets, totally different games, but the end game ultimately is the same, and that is to win. And for those of you who are really good at winning in sales and you've been thrust into this new environment of virtual selling, some of these tools and tips that we're going to share with you right now are built from research in terms of what actually works in the virtual selling environment. For those of you, there's that second camp of sellers who we come across who already did a lot of virtual interactions. In fact, we meet a lot of sellers who are, consistently high performers, and they never leave their home or they never leave their office because they sell virtually. And for those of you, welcome to those of you who find yourself in that camp. This is all about taking you to that next level of engagement and really helping you drive and foster much deeper and richer collaboration for you to get to know your buyers even better and to help advance your sales towards win more often. This is about honing those skills, and for those of you collecting new information that you can apply to realize even better levels of cut through in your virtual meetings. So for those of you, no matter which of those camps you may fall into, that's what we've focused this information on. So we're going to look at 4 areas in terms of how you capture attention and keep your buyers engaged in your virtual sales meetings. The first one is how we keep buyers engaged, and we're going to introduce and talk very quickly in terms of the engagement threshold and how you keep buyers above that engagement threshold. We love, as you can see, we love using Prezi, and Prezi is a partner in helping us display, use visuals, and drive interaction using technology more effectively. We're going to share a few tips in terms of how you use visuals and why you use visuals in order to drive and keep a buyer's attention and engagement during your virtual meetings. Then we're going to look at 2 very quick examples in terms of how you might engage at 2 stages of a typical sales process. One is, what are some ideas to keep buyers' attention and engagement during a needs discovery? And when you're solving problems with buyers, how might you do that in a virtual setting to keep and drive keep attention and drive engagement? So let's jump into these. Now, Spencer mentioned, and I'll close off with talking about the book. Rain Group's a research-based sales development organization. So we don't have a sage on a stage. We don't have a guru or someone that we go to and say, tell us how we must think in this certain selling scenario. In fact, what we do is we don't form an opinion. We don't form a view until we've done a significant amount of research in terms of what's going on in the seller's world, but most importantly, what's going on in our buyer's world. how are they buying? Now, in this instance, what we did was we were one of the first firms in the world during the pandemic, at the early stages of the pandemic, to go and research how buyers are buying in the pandemic, what's changed for them, and what are the challenges that they're facing from a buying perspective right now. Then we also studied sellers. We studied sellers from all the major geographic and advanced selling nations across the world. And we wanted to understand, in this new virtual setting, what's changed for you? What are the challenges you're facing as sellers in this new normal? And in response to that research and response to those challenges for both buyers and sellers in virtual selling, we realized that there was 4 very clear imperatives that would enable sellers to better connect with buyers, and for buyers to have a much more enjoyable and engaging experience when buying virtually than they did, in a non-virtual or face-to-face environment. Those four virtual selling imperatives are: how do we connect with buyers? How do we make that connection in a way that is professional, it is deliberate, it is orchestrated, and it's going to help us build and create a connection with the buyer in the virtual space that is different to doing so in the face-to-face world. Once we've made that connection, how do we drive engagement? And that's where we're focusing on that second virtual selling imperative today. How do we capture attention, maximize engagement, and how do we inspire virtually? Then the other 2 imperatives are: once we've engaged and we understand how to engage virtually, how do we collaborate more effectively? How do we shift from telling a buyer what they should do and a solution that they should consider that we're seeking to sell? How do we engage them so we shift the psychological ownership of that solution from seller to buyer in the virtual setting? And then last but not least, how do we influence our buyers effectively? And a lot of the influence in virtual selling actually happens outside of our live virtual meetings. And we talk about that further in the book. But today we're going to focus on engage. And what we found in that setting, and I'm just going to highlight these for us, is when we engage with sellers and we went around the world and we seek to find out what are the key challenges that they're facing in virtual selling at the moment. Here's what they told us: gaining buyers' attention and keeping buyers engaged, and changing the buyer's point of view on what's possible or how to solve a problem. And so when we think about that, these 2 challenges, in a small way, or for some of you on today's webinar, in a major way, are the things that are inhibiting you, that are stopping you from breaking through and realizing that level of peak performance in your role as a seller in this new virtual setting. So the aim of these challenges is to not overcomplicate the solutions to them. Gaining a buyer's attention and keeping a buyer engaged virtually was, when 91% of sellers were saying that this was a major problem that they were facing in this new selling normal. And then when we think in terms of that second challenge, creating intrigue. Creating intrigue is one of the key ways to keep buyers' attention. And then we need to build participation to maintain that attention and drive that engagement by using reveals. And so that's the basis of how we're going to realize a level of engagement. And we term that level of engagement and how we measure that level of engagement by what we define as the engagement threshold. Now, the engagement threshold is the point at which the attention of a buyer during your virtual selling meeting is captured and maintained. And below that engagement threshold, it is where we found attention is lost. So let me just bring this up on screen. Now, if we think in terms of this graph, most sellers underplan and underprepare for their virtual meetings. In fact, what we find is planning takes place in face-to-face. When we did some research in terms of face-to-face, we found that most sellers in face-to-face selling do a lot of their planning between when the car door closes and the office door opens in a face-to-face setting. Now, that might be okay for a lot of you, but there's so many more things that you are going to need to do when you make that transition to virtual to keep your buyers' attention. It's not going to work in the virtual world because you simply won't get above the engagement threshold if you think that you can just on the fly plan and think that things are going to flow organically in a virtual setting, because the starting point of engagement is simply higher in a virtual setting. And then it's magnified with larger groups when you consider what we call the Ringleman Effect. So let me just explain what the Ringleman Effect is in this next slide. All of you are going to face it. It's omnipresent in virtual meetings based on the volume of people that you engage with those virtual at those virtual meetings. And what it means is this. Now, just when you, in terms of this graph, it's not a scientific graph, it's for illustrative purposes. The bottom line is, in virtual meetings, as you add more people, it gets exponentially harder. Now, notice the rate of the curve when you contrast physical versus virtual. The more people that you have in your virtual sales meetings or your virtual sales conversations with your buyers, the more they disengage individually. And it's simply easier to hide in a virtual meeting. That's why some of you are struggling with that level of cut through. The more people equals the more disengagement. So we've got to think in terms of ways to capture and keep buyers' attention. Now, if you think about it, we've gone from, in a lot of cases, having full conference rooms where we can sit 5, 10, we can roll in a bunch of subject matter experts, whether they be technical experts, they might be specific industry experts. We might come with a flood or a team of sellers to join us on these conversations. And then we might be met with a team of buyers. And we can sit there and we can engage and we can look around the room and we can work out what's doing. We can plan who's going to do what, who's going to present, who's going to jump up on the whiteboard. We can do that. We can do that without even planning in some cases. The challenge is we're now in a very small box, and that box is the box that you can control in your virtual selling conversations. And we need to be much more deliberate in terms of how we show up in order to capture and keep buyers' attention. So we've got to think about some of the very simple tools that are afforded to us in order to be able to do that. A couple of things, and it depends on what platform you use. Obviously, with Prezi, there is a myriad of things that we can do in order to be more deliberate in terms of how we craft our presentations or areas that we want to drive collaboration and discussion through. And the flow and speed at which we can use a presentation, keep visual engagement between buyer and seller on our screen, and not have a drab or boring engagement. And therefore we capture and are more likely to keep attention more effectively. So let's think about some of those simple tools that are afforded to us in order to be able to capture and keep attention in our, no matter which platform you use. Being able to share something on screen is a really simple tool to be able to do that. For those of you who are using different platforms that have digital whiteboards, being able to bring up post-it notes, being able to bring up opportunities for your buyers to annotate on screen, being able to do so at intervals that drive and keep buyers' attention. Now let's talk about those intervals, because we've formed a view in terms of what we've seen a lot of sellers do successfully in the virtual setting to keep buyers' attention and to drive better engagement. And one of the tools that we'll share with you is what we call the 30+3 rule. What's the 30+3 rule? Well, at every 3 minutes, there or thereabouts, inside your virtual sales meetings with your buyers, you need to think about, for 30 seconds, how do we reconnect, re-engage each of the buyers in that virtual meeting in order to bring their focus to something that's on screen that will re-engage them. And so the very simple way, and for those of you, if you want one tool to dramatically change how you plan, be more deliberate, to keep attention and drive engagement in your virtual selling conversations, is plan out, let's say, a 60-minute meeting. Now, I would say 60-minute virtual meeting is a long meeting, but you need to plan that out really effectively. Now, think about it. If you were a buyer sitting there and someone was going to talk at you and present to you for 60 minutes, how might that make you feel? Well, I can tell you, for most of us, we get what we define as virtual meeting fatigue. And that is where we have a glare intensity. We're constantly focused on the screen. And ultimately, what ends up happening is that focus has to be reignited by us, which doesn't always happen as a human, or someone else needs to reignite that focus back onto the topic point. And what we found is that focus starts to wane about every 3 minutes. So we want to change our point of engagement up for 30 seconds every 3 minutes. It's the 30+3 rule. It's something that we found has had a huge impact to sellers in terms of the way in which they plan and execute much more attention grabbing and engaging virtual meetings. So think about the engagement threshold. Think about how we create intrigue and build anticipation around our reveals. Now, the next point we're going to look at is how we use visuals. Now, if we think in terms of the human brain, it takes only 13 milliseconds for the human brain to process an image. And when people hear information, they're likely to remember only 10% of that information. And that usually only lasts for about 3 days after that point of connection. So if a relevant image is paired with that same information, people's level of retention climbs to 65% of that information 3 days later. So for those of you who are like, I'm not a designer, Andy, I'm a seller, I'm really good at my craft, I'm a subject matter expert, I'm here to bring those solutions, you're still going to need to create that cut through in your virtual meetings. And so one of the quickest ways to have your buyers remember what you are, the messages you are seeking to land, is to do so with images. The human brain processes images 60,000 times faster than text. And 80% of people remember what they see, compared to 10% what they hear and 20% of what they read. So most people only read 20 to 28% of the words on that page. Most of you right now will be looking at that image of the brain, and then you'll be looking at the images and the corresponding percentages that relate to that, and forming your own visual view in your mind as you process right now. And that's the way the brain works. So if you're going to turn up in any virtual setting, in any virtual meeting with your buyers, and you're seeking to drive attention to your points and the points you want them to own, the more you do that with visuals, the much more likely they are to remember, process, and ultimately in some way own what you are seeking to say. So using visuals is critically important. Using moving visuals, and as you'll see, the great thing we love about Prezi is that it adds the human factor on a part of the screen, in the way we've designed this one, and it involves visual facts that we're presenting, and we can move those around to drive different levels of engagement at each time. So this platform actually talks to the principles and what we find works incredibly well in virtual selling, and that's why we're partnered with Prezi in terms of talking about this. So the 7 keys to using effective use of graphics: strong opening visuals. Think about the engagement threshold and how often you're going to use those visuals. Inject builds into the use of them. Use annotations. I know some virtual meeting platforms have annotation. I think most of them are moving towards that way. So think about how can we use annotation. The minute you have any buyers engaging with you on screen around important points you want them to remember or own, the level of engagement, the level of ownership multiplies dramatically. So annotation is a really good way to get your buyers involved in your virtual settings. Use questions to drive interactivity. Of course, we all know that stories sell. Define stories, but we use this term in virtual selling: mini stories sell, not stories. Stories, you often can lose people. You want to make them short, sharp, and shiny, and hyper connected and contextually appropriate to the point you're seeking to make. And then don't overcomplicate things. What we're finding is those who have transitioned to virtual selling, who are getting tremendous cut through, particularly in keeping buyers' attention, don't overcomplicate things. In fact, they strip things back, particularly text, and dramatically increase simple visuals and the frequency at which those visuals move on screen in order to capture attention and keep buyers engaged. Now, let's get into some of the more practical things that we can do and bring them to life. One of the things that a lot of you are going to do a needs discovery virtually. You're going to have that first meeting booked. You're going to jump on with your buyers, and we're going to perform a needs discovery. For some of you, this is the first time you may even be face-to-face with your buyers. So we want to make sure that first meeting, particularly one where you're going to seek to form a deep understanding of the buyer's needs, is done so in a really great way. First thing that we've seen get tremendous cut through is what happens before we jump on the meeting. Now, for some of you who are used to, I've got all my questions, I know all the things I want to ask, that's great. The challenge is we're moving from face-to-face to virtual. So we need to think in terms of, well, what are the things that we want to cover and not miss in terms of our discovery? So a well-planned discovery checklist, having a template, having some key areas that you're going to explore in order to deeper dive and form a really good understanding of the set of needs and the impacts of those needs is critically important. Preparing for that gets cut through in terms of your needs discovery. Now, if we think in terms of inquiry, we need to be thinking in terms of not just preparing for uncovering problems, but also preparing in terms of what are the areas of aspiration, what are the goals, what are the objectives that we're seeking to uncover in this virtual meeting, and think in terms of how might we then, when we uncover these, display them on screen? How might we capture them? One of the biggest challenges that buyers tell us is in virtual settings is where they'd be able to watch you in a needs discovery, capture notes while you're asking questions and they're sharing with you their need. In a virtual setting, often they're looking at your face, and let me just go to camera right now. Often they're looking at your face in this box during that virtual needs discovery, and you're facing down writing notes. Now, we need to think about that. You're not doing anything wrong because you're capturing notes, you're thinking about it. But what is the view that your buyer has right now of you visually? They're looking at you looking down. They don't know what you're doing. In a conference room, they know what you're doing. In a virtual setting, they don't. So we need to be thinking about what's a better way to drive engagement during that needs discovery. What we've seen is simple thing. Have a Word doc or a notepad or a virtual whiteboard on the screen and capture notes as you go, demonstrating the things that you're picking up. What we find is the focus of the buyer during that virtual needs discovery goes to the screen, and they're clearly seeing what they're sharing is being captured, and it's something of value to you, obviously, because you're capturing it. The second thing is what we see is they interact by reading what you're saying and making sure that you're capturing it in a way that appropriately describes how they feel and how they'd like to describe their current challenges that they are seeking help with. So preparation and thinking in terms of how to show up at a discovery meeting, and then during that discovery meeting, driving interaction in order to keep their attention, critically important. Another question, the most asked question that we get from sellers around the world is this: how do I get my buyers to turn on their video during our virtual meetings? Well, what we found is that for those people who didn't talk in terms of video before a virtual sales conversation with a buyer beforehand, we were seeing an average rate of video in the 30%. So in 30% of cases, sellers were telling us that buyers would turn up and turn their video on. That means there's a significant gap of around 70% of sellers engaging with buyers on virtual meetings without any video. It's just as good as a phone call. It's one dimension of connection. It's just hearing someone. So video adds that second dimension of connection. Face-to-face adds the full 3 dimensions of connection. So we want to do our best to create connection so that we can drive attention and keep engagement. And so one of the key things that you're going to need in your meetings is video. You need to be able to see each other. So what we found that had a significant impact was when you, in an email before you do, in this case, a needs discovery, you talk in terms of why connecting, having all buyers connected in that meeting on video is so important. And when we found sellers added that to an email, that simple line as to why they should be on video, we found that rate went from 30% to late 80% in terms of buyers turning up and connecting on video. So make sure you've got a needs discovery checklist of the things that you're going to do before, how you're going to engage buyers to have them on video, and what you're going to do during that needs discovery. Think in terms of the follow-up questions you've got, and think about tools in terms of, we use and recommend a tool like Menti. You can use that on any platform. You bring that on screen. You can capture paragraphs live from the participants in your meeting. You can do surveys, polls, and you can do collaborations. It's a really good way of using the 30+3 rule to inject ways of interacting. And then a simple thing you can do is scribe real time to show that whatever we're discussing is being captured. And often it brings the buyer's attention to that and something that they can collaborate with you at various points on. Last but not least, a lot of you solve problems for your clients in your virtual conversations. And there's no reason why you can't do that virtually. So when you think in terms of how you might collaborate, how you might drive attention, keep engagement going in a really powerful way during your virtual selling conversations, templates are a fantastic way to do that. We have a template here. I'll just show you an example of what we encourage our sellers to use. We bring this up on screen. We have it live annotated as we're talking through, what's your current state? What are the challenges you're facing at the moment? What are the problems? What are the goals that you're unable to realize, or desires that you have that you want to realize? What's that new reality? What's the future state that you're looking to achieve? And what's the gap in between current state and new reality that we're going to focus on? And in some cases, we use this tool as a virtual collaboration tool to talk about that solution and to talk about things the buyers have explored before, and things that would be palatable, or ways in which they think we could solve it. Have the sellers add their ideas and ways in which they think they could solve it, and really use this as the blueprint for driving change in order to find that solution that the buyer's wanting. This is a really simple template. It has tremendous effect because of its simplicity, and it can be applied in most virtual selling conversations. It's a template. And so for those of you who don't want to use this, I'd encourage you to think of a template that you can use on screen to collaborate with your buyers in order to keep their attention and drive further engagement. As you'll see, that's a completed version of one that was very successful. When it's finished, it's also something that you can tidy up, something that they're familiar with, that they've already collaborated on. You could send that as your next conversation starter to your buyers. 7 out of every 10 buyers are open to collaborating. What we find is the greatest inhibitor to collaboration in the virtual meeting setting is the preparedness of the seller to do so. So preparation is key. Templates are a very simple solution to help you be prepared and create cut through using that. 34% of buyers say sellers are effective at collaborating and interacting with me virtually. 34%, significant gain there. There's a big need for collaboration from buyers. It's up to us as sellers to bridge that gap and start showing up prepared to be able to collaborate in our virtual selling conversations. So obviously there's a few things here that we found. When you don't collaborate, you don't build rapport, you often diminishes your understanding of their need. Therefore, it diminishes your ability to solve that problem effectively for the buyers. We don't get to inspire buyer with new ideas or change their perceptions. And ultimately, the net effect is it stops you from winning deals. So there's very simple ways in which we can solve problems. As I said, we have a 4-stage problem-solving process that we use incredibly effectively in our virtual settings. Once again, this is a tool that we use and inject it and encourage our sellers to inject it into their virtual selling conversations. But if you've got a problem-solving process, you need to think about, how do I bring that process to life in a collaborative and in an engaging way to keep buyers' attention during our virtual selling conversations? In this case, we use this process over 30 minutes in a virtual meeting to take any problem that the buyer is looking to solve and to be able to help them work through that process to capture ideas they never thought possible and create actions towards solving that. It's highly engaging. It's disruptive in terms of what it brings. But all I've done as a seller is identify a problem-solving process and figure out a way to bring it to life in a virtual meeting. So we've talked about how we keep buyers engaged in terms of creating intrigue, building reveals, using visuals. And we've shared tools to be more prepared and planned around driving collaboration, improving engagement, and keeping buyers' attention during both the needs discovery and through problem-solving stages of the sales process that we take the buyer through. I'm going to hand it back to Spencer. I will say that for those of you who want a lot more meat on the bone in terms of this, please, you can find all of that in our virtual selling book, and I'll be here to take your questions now on anything specific that you'd like more information from. Thank you.
Fantastic. Awesome job, Andy. Really interesting. We've got a bunch of questions, so let's jump right in. The first one at the beginning was from Bob Brill, and he says, Andy, what's your experience approaching prospects who will not meet in person, however, seem to be adverse to the use of video virtual meetings? Yeah.
So I want us to, and I encourage sellers all the time, I want you to kind of step back out of your selling desire, your the way you respond and want to sell. And I want you to switch positions for a second. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the buyer. And in this case, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the prospect. Now, prospects only say no due to two reasons. One is value and two is time. And the two are directly linked. And so for virtual, what we found was prospecting had tremendous success in that first kind of 3 months of the pandemic. Why? For those of you who were selling to people who were suddenly finding themselves moving from an office to a home environment, we found that there was a level of discretionary time that was built. Why? Because things had changed. People weren't into their normal routine. They didn't have full calendars. And what we saw in that first 12 weeks was a lot of available time. Therefore, anyone prospecting during that time got a lot of cut through because people were picking up the phone and having conversations to connect with people, even if they didn't know they had a need for that. Now that's changed back. It's gone back now. And so the issue that we have here is, first of all, how do we connect with that prospect in a way that they see value? Now, you have eight seconds to capture a buyer's attention in any reach out through your prospecting, whether it be through a LinkedIn email, whether it be through an email, whether it be through a phone call. And what we find is that value inspection is magnified right now, right? We're back to that time poor space where everyone is analyzing what you are saying and whether it aligns to two things. One, their strategic objectives or their tactical objectives. And so, actually to get cut through, to get them on video, to get them engaging, that all happens in two ways. One, they understand that there is significant value in spending 30 minutes of time listening to what you have to say because it aligns to their strategic objectives or their tactical objectives. It's landed in that space. I have something to listen to. Two, we need to talk about the value when we are seeking to connect with them in a virtual meeting, the value of connecting with video. Why is that important? Because if it's not important, and they're not comfortable in doing that, there's no valid reason for them to turn video on, and they won't. They won't change unless there's a reason why they should change. So they're the things I hope in terms of the value message that you craft, and then give reasonable reason as to why they should turn video on and connect with you.
Cool, fantastic. We have some more questions, but in the interest of time, because we want to try and keep people to the hour, what I'll do is I'll make sure that we send the questions to you afterwards, Andy, and then maybe if you want to do some responses, we can send that out with the recording or after the recording as well.
But typically what I'll do is we field lots and lots of questions, more than we can handle. I'll record a Zoom and then I'll post that to you.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So with that, I'll kick into my session in terms of how can we do a engaging virtual presentation. So before we do that, I think we have to ask ourselves a fundamental question for giving a virtual presentation, and that's, or any presentation, and that's, why are we actually giving the presentation? Because I believe when you peel back all of the different layers, it doesn't matter whether it's more of a hard sales pitch or whether you're doing like a QBR internally, that what we're really trying to do is to persuade somebody. We're trying to persuade somebody to think differently, to act differently, and more importantly, to feel differently about whatever it is that we're going to present to them. So the real question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we do a persuasive virtual presentation when we're all trapped in this tiny little box that we find ourselves in? So for me, the first stage of this is to look at attention, because attention is the gateway to connection, which helps us get to a decision. Now, there's a lot of myths around attention. One of them is, yeah, but if you have a video that's more than 30 seconds, then nobody's going to watch it or listen to you because it's too long. But how is it then that later on today, when you're at home on the sofa, you may quite possibly see this pop up on the screen? Now, if we're honest with ourselves, we've all seen this. If you have Netflix, we've all seen this pop up on the screen. Now, what this tells me is that it is entirely possible to hold somebody's attention for hours, let alone a 20-minute call or a 30-second video. So what's going on here? What can we learn from this that's going to help us in our virtual presentation meeting? Well, for this, we can look to Hollywood, because Hollywood figured out something much quicker about getting our attention and keeping our attention for long periods of time. And besides, I've always wanted to be in a James Bond movie, and bear with me, thanks to the power of Prezi video, I can now put myself in a James Bond movie, joking aside. So we can actually look at a James Bond movie and get clues to how we can hold people's attention. So I'm going to show you two clips from two James Bond movies. This on the left here, you're going to see is from Quantum of Solace, 2008. And the one on the right is from Dr. No in 1962. Now, as I play the video, try and see what the differences are. It's exactly the same scene. It's a car chase through a construction site, but maybe type into the chat box, what differences do you see between these two clips as I play them? Now, as you're doing this, the first thing you'll see is obviously there's no sound. Now, because there would be, if it was two tracks together, it would be too much chaos. But what you should know is in the Quantum of Solace 2008, there's a very dramatic and fast piece of music playing on top of the existing scene noise. Whereas in Dr. No, you only hear the car engine and the squealing of the tires as it goes around the corner. Now, what you also start to see in Dr. No in 1962, it's a fixed camera. It stays on Sean Connery and doesn't move around a lot. Whereas when you see the scene of Inside the Car with Daniel Craig, the camera is shaking all over the place. So you have this movement that makes you feel like you're in the car. And Brian, quite rightly in the chat, said there's also faster cuts. So when you look at Quantum of Solace, the jump cuts between a camera angle or between scenes is really, really short. Whereas when you're watching Dr. No now, you're almost tapping your feet saying, come on, get on with it already. So what this shows us is that movement is a huge part of spiking dopamine in our brain, which makes us pay attention. The thing that they do with jump cuts and shaking camera is exactly the same thing that happens on our mobile phones when we're scrolling through our news feeds. Now, we can use this in our presentations because we have lots of movement that we can use. We can put a video like this that I've done here, and you have the movement of the Prezi animations, which also spike dopamine and grab attention. But I think more importantly, we have our movement, our body, our eyes, smile, these little micro movements that you see. Now, if I take the camera feed away, now it's suddenly starting to get harder to concentrate on what I'm saying because you don't see me anymore and it feels more static. And that's when you start to check your phone or let the cat out. So what we need to do is make sure that we stay on the screen for the maximum amount of time possible, because this helps people keep paying attention to what it is that you're saying. So that's attention. Now, let's see how that then helps us with making an emotional connection to people, because a huge part of how we make a decision happens at an unconscious level, and it's about emotional connection. Now, I could do a whole talk on how you use content and things like storytelling to do emotional connection. But in this virtual little box, how do we make an emotional connection to somebody person to person when we're not in the same room? Well, for me, I can call on Winston Churchill to give us some clues. So he has this amazing quote, which says that if you want to move somebody to emotion, then you must first be swamped with it yourself. If you want to move somebody to tears, your own tears need to fall first. And if you want to convince somebody of something, then you yourself must believe it first. Now, what this tells me is in order for those three things to happen, you need to see me, because you're seeing what's written all over my face, to use the saying. And we can also look at Hollywood, because again, when you think about, and this is meant to be the saddest movie of all time, but when you think about when you're on the sofa and you're watching a really powerful movie or a sad movie, what's that moment where you suddenly have this well of emotion in your body, your heart's beating faster or your eyes are beginning to well up? It's normally when you see the protagonist of the movie or the series going through something really emotional. We respond to the emotion that we see on the other person. And this is something that's been between us as people for millennia. You know, many cultures and tribes have, you know, even greetings. The Zulu tribe has Sawubona, which literally translates as I see you and I see the ancestors that came before you. And it's the same in India and Nepal with Namaste. It means I bow to you, I see you. So for me, this is a super, super powerful way that we need to see each other in order to make that emotional connection, to help somebody think about the idea of what we're talking about. Now, what we're also seeing is this happening in education. There's an amazing report that just came out from the American Psychological Association, and where they've now seen in the last 12 months, where obviously schools went online, that the places where the teacher was on video and the students could see the teacher's face, it boosted attention and retention because they respond to eye movements and micro movements of the eyebrow. So again, what we need to constantly think about is not doing this, where we lose that connection and we lose the movement, but is to make sure that we maximize the amount of time on camera. So that's just a couple of things about how we can actually make a connection with somebody. But what about the content? What else can we put in our presentation that's going to make it a little bit more persuasive? Well, this is something we've been developing at Prezi, and it's called the Virtual Presentation Framework. I'm not going to go through it in a really big way now. You're actually the first people to see this. This is hot off the press, and we're going to be creating a lot of content around this. But for now, just think about or see there's the three pillars, if you like: credibility, trust, and emotion. So these are the three things that you need in order to persuade somebody. And what we're seeing now if you look at the credibility ring, some of the things that we've all been dealing with: camera, lighting, clothing, background, sound, all those things are kind of becoming table stakes in terms of putting on a credible performance together. But trust and emotion are equally important because that's how we make a decision. We need to emotionally connect to it, and there's a lot of things that you can use, from rhetoric, storytelling, etc. And then with trust, that's where you need to say to somebody, it's okay, this is a good idea, I'll prove to you, I'll give you evidence, and you use things like charts and data and things like that. So that, if you want to know more about this, then you can find me on LinkedIn, send me a connection request, just search for Spencer Waldron at Prezi, or go to the Prezi blog and subscribe to the Prezi blog. And we're going to start producing a lot of content around this. So just to keep an eye out. But let's go a little bit deeper for a second into this emotion plus trust. How can we put that into our content? Well, you can use this really powerful little matrix that I use all the time, not just for presentations, also for meetings when I go in. And it was originally created by a guy called Andrew Abella, and it's called the Think Do Matrix. And you basically fill in the 4 boxes. What does my audience think now before I give that presentation? And what do I want them to think afterwards? And the same for do. What does my audience do right now? How are they acting? And what's the action that I want them to take afterwards? Now, because of my obsession with emotional connection and the part it plays in decision making, I quite cheekily added a third piece to this little matrix. Sorry, Andrew. Because I think when you ask the question, how does somebody feel about something, and how do you want them to feel about it afterwards, that really gets to the crux of how you make an emotional connection with somebody. So once you've done this, you can then just think about all the content that you might want to put into the presentation or the conversation. And if it doesn't help you make those kind of changes happen, then there's a good chance that it doesn't want to be in the presentation. So a really, really good little way of deciding that. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is something called conversational presenting. And I think Andy hinted at this in some of the content that he was talking about. And this is something, it's not new. We saw salespeople starting to have a lot of success from this, probably 3 or 4 years ago. But it's based around this idea, we'll take BMW as the example. So this is a BMW showroom. And when you think about it, showrooms haven't really changed that much in decades. Now, luckily, the cars got a lot better. But what they started to see, and it wasn't just BMW, it was all the car showrooms, all the car manufacturers, is what they started to see is that people were no longer coming to the showroom 10 times. They were coming once. Now, can you guess why that was the case? And you may start to think about the fact that they could get all the information that they would normally get from the salesperson in the car showroom from the website. Because if you go to the BMW website, you can practically build the car. You can, add all the optional extras and choose the colors, but you don't find everything. And that's why you go back to the showroom or the BMW salesperson to find out those answers that you couldn't find. And this is why they launched the BMW Genius program. The BMW Genius mission is to get you into a conversation to find out what are the gaps in your information. So this becomes about discovery more than selling. How can I find the gaps in your information that you couldn't find elsewhere? And yes, you've probably guessed it, we need to do the same with our presentations because, and I'll give away my age a bit here, but this computer is pretty much like the computer that was sat on my desk in the mid-90s when I started work. And I couldn't do any research on that. I had to use the telephone line to even connect to the internet. So if I wanted to buy something, I would talk to a company, they would send me a brochure, and eventually a salesperson would come, and it was his or her job to kind of tell me all the information, transfer the information to me. But these days, I can now find everything on the internet. If marketing's doing their job properly, I can find out all that lovely information. But I still need to talk to somebody because I have a gap in my information. And this is what I always say to people if you're in sales. Have you ever had that message that says, "Oh, just email me the deck"? Now, when somebody says that, that's really symptomatic of they don't want the whole presentation. They just want to get the 3 bits of information that they couldn't find on the website. So what we need to do when we're in a presenting kind of moment with somebody is to switch from the presentation controlling the conversation to the other way around, to go in there and say, "Thank you for giving me 20 minutes. How can we best spend it?" And then I might have a whole load of content in my presentation, but I'm only going to present what's relevant depending on the directions, if you like, that I get from the person that I'm presenting to. So this is something that can also save you lots of time because, you know yourself as a salesperson, 95% of the questions you're going to get. You just don't know in advance what this particular person's going to ask. So you can build that whole presentation and then you don't need to tailor it with the exception of maybe swapping out a logo or something. But it's a super, super powerful way to present when you want to gain attention, when you want to get somebody to that decision-making point. Okay, so how can you do this with Prezi? And I want to kind of just show you a few of the things that you can do with Prezi video that are going to help you get that attention, keep that attention, and get people engaged when you do your virtual presentation. So this is actually a good example of how you could build an agenda for a video meeting, because I can have 6 things up here, but maybe depending on that initial conversation, I'll only pick 1 or 2. And, I can always take it away when we're in a conversation and then bring it back when it's relevant. Now, you can also do lots of other things with Prezi video. So for example, if you're doing a team meeting or an all hands meeting, then it's the same thing like we said at the beginning. You want people to think, act, and feel differently about what it is that you're doing. So you can use Prezi video in this kind of way to do the same kind of job. Now, what about charts? If you think back to what we said about emotion plus trust. So trust is through charts and data and things like that. And what most of us normally do is we just put the chart that we've got from somewhere. And what happens at that moment is the person in your audience stops listening to you and they're going, what does that mean? So our single biggest job when we do any kind of data visualization is to reveal the meaning behind the data. And the great thing now is I can bring myself inside the chart. Now you'll notice here, I removed anything that wasn't relevant to gray, because what I want people to see is that lovely hockey stick in bright yellow, and they can see, okay, salesperson B, something happened here that was really, really good. And then as the presenter, I can, give the detail of, hey, they started doing conversational presenting, started using Prezi video, and stopped screen sharing their slides. So a bit tongue in cheek, but you get the idea that you can be really, really engaging, even with putting up a chart that builds trust to help you get somebody to a decision. Now, some of the other things that we've been experimenting with here at Prezi, and I'll show you a little bit more of this later on, is things like hand gesture control. So the ability to combine movement and connection by bringing things up onto the screen just by using hand gestures to make content come on and then disappear again. So you can also think about, how do I interact with content with my hands? Because again, that focuses people's attention, but it also keeps their attention because of the movement that we spoke about earlier on. What about products? So yes, we can do a really cool presentation in Prezi video talking about our products, but you can take it further as well. You can actually say, okay, here's my product, and I can bring it onto the screen. And so maybe let's imagine I'm a salesperson for a technology for smart cities. So I can say, okay, here's the smart city, and here is where our 5G mesh network goes. And maybe here is where the load balancing architecture goes. So I can start to really bring it to life and show exactly where we are and interact with it at the same time. Now, I can also zoom into it and say, just here is the nice corner office that Andy has at the Rain Group. So you can do a lot of different things to bring that content alive, keep movement, keep engagement, and keep attention. Now, virtual events, this is a guy called Brian Fanzo, who is one of the most amazing people in virtual events. And again, I definitely recommend go check him out, Brian Fanzo. And he's doing really amazing stuff with Prezi video, because again, it helps him stand out amongst all of the other speakers, because he's doing something very different and not screen sharing the slides. And finally, you can do some fun stuff like trivia games. So if you want to just do something fun on a Friday afternoon with your team, then you can also start to bring this kind of fun alive in this as well. Okay, we've built a whole simple to use editor for this. You can do it in your lunch break. You literally can go in and add your text, add images. We've given you a lot of free stuff that you can use. You can obviously use templates and bring your own content in, a bit like Andy was doing. You can bring your slides in and present your slides in this environment. And you can obviously go live like I am tonight in a video conference, or you can pre-record. So you can just send it to somebody afterwards. And when you do go live, we work with pretty much every video conferencing platform out there. As long as you can choose the camera, so you choose the Prezi video virtual camera, then you'll be good to go. So to bring us home, I thought I'll give you a bit of a sneak peek about some of the other things that we've been working on. So if I was going to talk from a billboard and announce it, then we have two things. One is screen share, and the second is around hand gestures. So again, just to show you some of the things that we're thinking about in terms of where can virtual presenting go? How can you kind of make sure that you persuade somebody? Now, sometimes you're going to want to bring in a PDF onto the screen. You're going to want to bring a web page into the screen and have especially in internal meetings. So there's these kind of things that are going to happen. And again, just another example of our kind of some of the technology that we've been playing with is how you can bring hand gestures into it. So that's it. I hope you found it interesting and kind of looking at how we can actually do that kind of attention grabbing. If you want to learn more about what Prezi video is, then just go to prezi.com/video. That's prezi.com/video. And you can see some of the stuff that we're up to. So let's have a look at some questions. Let me take that away. Andy, how's it going?
Good. There was one question, I think it was from Terence, was talking about standing up. You and I are both standing up. I have just found that you engage better. In some cases, depending on who you are, you think quicker, yeah, it gives you a little bit more freedom, especially with Prezi. You'll see standing up, I still have the room to move. I've still got my real estate, but then I can present as well. So the answer from me would be absolutely. I think it's a game changer in virtuals to be standing up.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, it just gives me a whole different energy. The second I sit down, you might start to slouch, or so for me, it's like, yeah, I've tried both and I always come back to standing up. It makes me feel different. And I think it gives a better experience for the audience as well. It's keeps you on your toes, so to speak. Okay, let me have a look at some of these questions. So David asks, can Prezi work as a visible virtual whiteboard like Andy described? Not yet, but I would love that we can actually write live on and see it appear. It's a great idea. This is one of our big problems, is that the world is very big in terms of what we can do with this. How do you create your own templates? What I tend to do is we have a lot of templates for you already inside. And what I do is I just take an existing template and I'll change the colors and go from there. So yeah, if you have somebody who's a designer in your company, then they can maybe build something bespoke. But yeah, start with one of our templates. It's super quick, super easy. Is there an ideal length to keep a virtual presentation? That's a question from Scott Brown. Thanks for that question, Scott. It's a hard question to answer. I think like I would always err on as short as possible. And I think like for me, it's what I said in the middle of my session about just turning it around on its head and just saying like, thanks for giving me this time. It's such a precious gift that somebody gives to you these days. Like everybody wants everybody's time, and just saying like, how can this be the best, use of your time, and ask for directions, because you may suddenly find that you only need to present 5-10 minutes and that's enough. Or sometimes you might need to go deeper. And I think that's one of the things I've done a lot where, I'm always looking, and that's another reason why I'm always wanting the camera on, because you get a sense of whether somebody's going, oh, hang on a minute, I'm losing this person. And then I'll go back to the overview and I'll say, okay, what else can we talk about? So I think those kind of things come in important. And I love the question you were talking about earlier, Andy, in terms about putting camera on or not. And I think like this is like such a big thing, because there's a lot of people that don't. And I think sometimes that's because I'm not sure what this is going to be. So I think, like you said, making sure the prep is done before the meeting. But one thing that I found that works really, really well, because if you ask somebody to put the camera on, you're almost going to the opposite view of what they've said they're going to do. And if you just say to somebody, something like, if I was in your shoes, I'd probably feel the same way. Because when you do that, you kind of bring yourself together. It's not like you're in opposing views. And then you can start to say, hey, have you ever made an exception? Can I get you to put the camera on? And normally people will start to warm up. But again, for me, if I can get somebody on a camera, it's really important, because that's how you make that connection.
I just want to add two things. One, I can't tell you the importance of what Spencer said in terms of that template where you can go anywhere with your Prezi at your readiness, being able to then be facilitated by asking those questions from the buyer at the beginning of the meeting to completely tailor that experience for them. And the only thing I'd add to that is, once you've done your Prezi and done an amazing, collaborative, highly targeted job, keep it as short as possible. Try where you can to have that presentation lead to collaboration. And that will change the game in terms of your virtual meeting, and have your buyers going away going, not did I just get that information and had a great visual experience, the whole experience of engaging with that seller or that selling team was something that was net new. I haven't experienced that before. That drives emotional connection and buy-in to your message and to you as your brand.
Yeah. Cool. I'm conscious that we've hit the top of the hour, so I'll do the same. I'll make sure that I have a look through the questions, and then we can put some content together to bring that back. So really, thank you so much, everybody, for giving us some of your precious time. Like I say, we'll send out the recording soon so you can watch it afterwards. If Andy's okay with it, we'll also send the slides so you can see them as well. Andy, Thank you so much. Any final words from you?
No, keep it simple. Be deliberate and keep it simple. That preparation before virtual meetings is that if you prepare before you go and be deliberate and keep it simple. It's not, that's what I love about working with Prezi. We can keep it simple and the message lands. Well done. Thanks, Spencer.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a really good rest of your day or rest of your evening, depending on where you're from. Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you again next time. Thanks, everybody. Bye for now.